Happy New Year, everyone. I've been thinking about the Lewis and Clark expedition, dispatched into the wilderness by President Jefferson, who lived his long and productive life at a very high level of comfort. It's impossible to imagine Jefferson roughing it. He would have needed one of those Henry V royal tents with a wine steward and a chef, a wall of books, and perhaps a string quartet. Meanwhile, Meriwether Lewis, who had lived for 2 years in the White House before his great journey, was out in the middle of nowhere trying to propel a party of 33 men and 1 woman 10 to 20 miles per day in the direction of the Pacific Ocean. The only really civilized individual he could talk with during those 28 months was William Clark, who was an exceedingly able, practical, intelligent man, but not an intellectual. He was a frontiersman of Kentucky, the best man in the world to take on practical tasks one after the next, to accomplish them without fanfare, and to write them up with some of the worst spelling in exploration history. The Lewis and Clark expedition was a provisioning challenge, at times a provisioning nightmare, along the lines of the film Apollo 13. You can never take everything you're going to need, so you know from the start that you're going to run out of key supplies, and you're going to have to make do using your wits and whatever you can gather from the woods. Think of Clark as MacGyver. Take boots, for example. If I were going on a 7,689-mile hike, I would lay in a supply of the best footwear I could afford. The men of the expedition undoubtedly started out with good boots, but by the time they got to the Pacific coast in November of 1805, those boots were all either gone or on life support, and no duct tape in the toolbox. One of their men, Joseph Whitehouse, knew something about tailoring, or let us say skin dressing, and he supervised at Fort Clatsop the frontier manufacture of 338 pairs of moccasins. That's 676 individual moccasins, hand-stitched with sinew and awls. I have an image of a little Fort Clatsop crafting seminar, with Whitehouse explaining to the men how to measure their feet, cut rawhide, and stick a sharp awl through 2 layers of leather without jabbing your hands, which, by the way, you invariably do. I can see Toussaint Charbonneau cutting up and mouthing off, gruffly asserting that he ain't going to do no women's work, and so on, while his wife Sacagawea quietly turns out a perfect pair of beaded moccasins in 15 minutes. Since there were 33 in the permanent traveling party, that's 10 pairs of moccasins per person to get home to St. Louis, where you can bet one of the first things everyone did was find a shoe store. Boots are just a metaphor for all that was missing by January 1st, 1806. They had run out of whiskey. They were nearly out of tobacco, which is apparently the fuel that got the men to drag 60,000 pounds of gear towards the sunset. Whatever cloth clothing they had once had was long since gone. Lewis had to trade his fancy officer's coat for a canoe at one point, and he threw a little hissy fit, said, and you can hear the wounded pomposity, "I think the United States are indebted to me for another uniform coat, for that which I have disposed on this occasion was but little worn." To summarize, Lewis and Clark left St. Louis on May 14, 1804, in full military regalia, with a maximum payload of things that they would need to complete their epic journey. As they ascended what Lewis called the heretofore deemed endless Missouri River, they used up, lost, gave away, and broke most of what they had started out with, until by the time they reached the source of the Missouri on August 12, 1805, they had shed layer after layer after layer of the thin integument of civilization, and they were now reduced to what King Lear called unaccommodated man. Lewis himself observed that he had been transformed from a highly civilized man, friend of the president, member of the American Philosophical Society, Freemason, United States Army captain, into what he called a perfect Indian. By the time the expedition moved into Fort Clatsop just before Christmas 1805, Lewis's spiritual energy was largely spent. His mind was now fixated on just a couple of propositions. First, would they encounter some sort of trading vessel in the bays near the mouth of the Columbia from which he could resupply the expedition? He had in his possession a universal letter of credit with the seal of the United States supplied by the ingenious president. Second, What was the minimum amount of time they would have to stay in the vicinity of the Pacific Ocean to maximize their chances of encountering that trade vessel? It did not matter what country's flag it might be flying, but also the minimum amount of time the Bitterroot Mountains would need to be clear enough of the winter snowpack for them to punch through on their homeward journey. This last puzzle turned out to be one of the most frustrating challenges of the whole expedition. And third, how could the men and one woman of the Corps of Discovery occupy themselves through a lean winter in a rain-drenched place in a way that kept up their physical strength if possible, prevented them from the kind of cabin fever that could lead to quarreling or worse, and not lose their team spirit for what was apparently going to be a very, very long return journey, this time without even minimally adequate gear? They were really counting on that trade ship, and they were not going to meet one. All that must serve as background to Meriwether Lewis's New Year's Day journal entry at Fort Clatsop. I quote, "This morning I was awoke at an early hour by the discharge of a volley of small arms which were fired by our party in front of our quarters to usher in the new year. This was the only mark of respect which we had it in our power to pay this celebrated day. Our repast of this day, though better than that of Christmas, consisted principally in the anticipation of the first day of January 1807, when in the bosom of our friends we hoped to participate in the mirth and hilarity of the day, and when the zest given by the recollection of the present, we shall completely, both mentally and corporally, enjoy the repast which the hand of civilization has prepared for us. At present we were content with eating our boiled elk and wapato, and solacing our thirst with our only beverage, pure water." Poor homesick Meriwether Lewis. He wrote this journal entry as far from Philadelphia and the White House as it was possible to be and still be in North America. He's writing in hand-crafted moccasins at a desk hewn for him by the expedition's crude carpenters in a miserable hut without glass windows with a smoky fire in the crude fireplace, because the wood is wet, of course, and if he needs to use the bathroom, well, there's an Army regulation pit about 50 yards from the fort. His dinner is lean, half-rancid boiled elk, yum, and an insipid freshwater swamp potato known as the wapato root, dug up by Indian women with their feet as they stand in the swamps. You have to decide how to read the tone of his last phrase, solacing our thirst with our only beverage, pure water. Is he in near suicidal despair? Is he feeling sorry for himself? Is he pretending some cheerful and bemused commentary on their destitute state? Or is he quietly reveling in the heroic deprivations of the true hero, the authentic explorer who has recently marched 2,000 miles over a country on which the foot of civilized man has never trodden, as Lewis put it? We don't quite know. What we do know is that Lewis is thinking about Thomas Jefferson's annual New Year's Day reception at the White House. Lewis has participated in at least one of those splendid gatherings, perhaps two, and he is determined to be at the January 1st, 1807 White House party. Champagne, 4 or 5 or even 7 different types of wine, a fabulous array of desserts, pies, sweetmeats, cold cuts, and maybe even Jefferson's celebrated baked Alaska, a hot puff pastry which, when you cut into it, reveals a creamy ball of frozen ice cream. Oh my, bring it, and I think perhaps I'll pass on that wapato casserole, Mr. President. Who would not want to share in Thomas Jefferson's hospitality, his exquisite sense of taste, his fussy insistence on the finest European wines that could be procured in the United States in 1807, his graciousness, plus music by the Marine Corps Band, which Jefferson has made his own, and perhaps even a bit of whatever is left of the world's largest cheese. Women in beautiful dresses with early 19th century cleavage, conversations with senators, scientists, philosophers, and even America's Da Vinci himself, the third President of the United States, the Honorable Thomas Jefferson. Who wouldn't be homesick? Have another glass of pure water, Captain Lewis. Time is now on your side. I'm Clay Jenkinson, wishing you a Happy New Year to all of our friends at the Thomas Jefferson Hour. I'm Clay Jenkinson.